This video is brought to you by the 3 Minute Board Game patrons. Keep us independent by supporting us on Patreon. Kia ora koutou and welcome to this year's Top 100. Now as always, this is my personal Top 100, so take the whole list with that grain of salt. In addition, I'd like to bring up the thing I mentioned at the start of the video, that 3 Minute Board Games does not do paid content, and to keep us independent by supporting us on Patreon. You see, so much board game content out there is just paid ads. We don't do that stuff. All the opinions within are mine and mine alone. So if you want to keep independent voices out there, support a channel like mine on Patreon. Or you can buy some merchandise in our online store. So support content made from the heart, not made for the publishers. Support us on Patreon. Now, on to the list. This cute looking family tree building game packs a lot of decisions into its small box and short playtime. So it turns out I really like polynomino placing games. I described this one to my friends as terraforming the Isle of Cats. And as I like both those games, that's a good thing. A brutally tough solo only game that you'll enjoy if you like risk management, scary dice rolls, and a ton of narrative elements. I really like how Nemo's different motivations really change how you approach each game. Though not as simple and charming as the original Azul, Summer Pavilion adds a level of crunch and extra complexity that make it feel like a very worthy successor and advanced mode of the original Azul. As a rule, I find most roll and writes the antithesis of fun. Either not enough interaction in person, or not enough depth to justify it as a solo game. Hadrian's Wall is the exception to these rules. It really is one of the best solo games on the market, and head and shoulders above its peers. One of the best zombie survival games ever made. Works best when played as a semi-cooperative where everyone has their own selfish goal. Tends to fall apart when there's a full-blown traitor in the game though. Some really good narrative elements here, and I love that you're not just one character, you're the leader of a group of survivors. This quaint looking village life worker placement game has a lot going for it, especially when you add in the 2 expansions which complete the game for me. While many might think, village, that sounds super boring. You get invested in the lives of your little people, and the natural cycle of death in this game, and letting your family members live out their lives, adds a level of emotional attachment you don't normally get in your average dry Euro. Freedom the Underground Railroad is a serious game about a very serious theme, and while many people have talked about that at length, what's overlooked is just how tight this game is. It's an incredibly tight experience where you have to maximize every move. Pan Am takes a lot of the tropes from train games and turns them on their head. Instead of trying to build the most extensive network possible, you're trying to build one that's desirable for Pan Am to buy it. And this wacky quirk, combined with its relatively simple rules, make it a game that a heck of a lot of groups would enjoy. Root has been tricking people into playing a counterinsurgency war game since it came out, and while it's full of cute and fluffy murder, what really makes the game stand out is the asymmetry of its factions, even if some of those combinations are a little broken at times. Imperial Spells and Steam is a weird train game. Like, it does a lot of what you expect in a train game, building networks and collecting resources. But it also adds in spells and a whole bunch of other weirdness. And you know what? That just makes it more engaging and interesting. It's a very fancy and expensive game though. If you've ever considered a solo war game, try Pavlov's House. This game goes from the operational level right down to the people inside Pavlov's house and exactly where they're placed. A really neat and novel experience. A really fascinating and interesting game. The Reckoners is a co-op game where you're trying to take down an evil supervillain. The thing I really dig about this one is that all players can take their actions in any sequence they want. And it's understanding this unique pacing that it's not just I take all my turn and you take all your turn, that we can split actions between ourselves freely, which in a big group can lead to some really interesting discussions that make the Reckoners a very interesting co-op. If Ticket to Ride is a pop song, then Android is a 2-hour-long prog metal concept album. It's an incredibly involved and busy game with far too much happening. The reason I like it so much is because of its ambition and its amazing world building. What looks like a game about a murder mystery is really a game about the characters in it, and resolving their personal stories is really the focus of the game. There's a lot to admire here, but it's not a game I actually recommend people go and pick up, unless you're really interested by just checking out how ambitious a game this was. Scythe is an interesting game that combines a whole bunch of Euro game mechanics with a little bit of Ameritrash biff. It's a bit of a kitchen sink game, there's a lot happening in it, but it all seems to work quite well together. And a game that set the standard for blinged out modern Kickstarters. Still, doesn't it look pretty? Abyss is a pretty straightforward drafting and set collection game, but there are 2 things I really dig about it. The first is its art and its style, its undersea kingdom full of weird, creepy monsters. And the second is the pearls. There are very few things in board gaming more satisfying than having a pearl clinked into your cup. Final Girl takes the systems from Hostage Negotiator, tweaks and upgrades them, and turns them into a great little slasher solo game. Final Girl is a really cool thematic experience, based around the Final Girl circuit from slasher films. But be warned, it's not for those who are scared of dice. Agents of Smersh is a gonzo as hell spy adventure game. It has a book full of 2,000 different encounters, and the game really is about roaming the map, having these wacky James Bond Austin Powers style encounters. And I'm really looking forward to playing the Epic edition of this game, which has just arrived. I can already tell after reading the rulebook that it's got rid of some of the bloat that Smersh had. Star Realms is a great game when you just want to have a fight for a few minutes. It has very simple deck building rules, but the conflict escalates really quickly. A lot of fun, easy to teach, and very portable. Galaland Moons is still one of my favourite area control games. I really like the simplicity and elegance of its core rule set, as well as the emergent powers you pick up throughout the game. A lot to love here, but it might be pretty hard to pick up these days. I'm not a fan of hidden movement games, but Last Friday does something that I really appreciate. The first of which is its theme. As mentioned with Final Girl, I'm a sucker for the slasher theme, and Last Friday is absolutely dialing into those tropes. The second is that it's essentially 4 games in one, and can be played out over 4 different chapters. And throughout the course of those chapters, it's not just the killer hunting down the counselors every single time. In fact, in the final chapter, they get to completely reverse that. And it's the back and forth nature of this game that sets it apart from other games like Letters from Whitechapel or Fury of Dracula, where the pursuit is always a bit samey. Instead of trying to mimic the computer game, XCOM the board game replicates the feelings you have when you play XCOM the PC game. And that is the feeling of abject terror and panic. This is an app-enabled real-time cooperative game, and the whole time you are playing it, you will be stressed to all hell. And that's what I really love about XCOM. Panic in a box. The coolest thing about Castles of Mad King Ludwig is the neat little castles you build throughout the game, with their wacky layouts and different rooms. And despite it being about building those wacky rooms in your castle, it still is a very tight and very engaging competitive game. A space race game like no other. This one feels like an absolute race. But it's not a sprint, it's a triathlon. You see, the game is played across 3 different eras. You start off with the inner solar system, then the outer solar system, and finally go intergalactic. And each level you play can be played by itself, or you can play them one after the other, with each new level adding extra complexity. A must for anyone who likes the idea of space exploration. Between Two Cities is a game all about positive interactions, because you're trying to build 2 different cities in collaboration with the person to your left and the person on your right. This is one of my go-to games that I teach people when they're new to the board gaming hobby. Its ratings fallen a little over the last few years because the scores end up being pretty samey. And while it's nice and safe and great for teaching people, the scoring system means you really have to stuff up to get a bad score in this one. I love me a good 4X game, and Eclipse Second Order of the Galaxy is exactly that. With a playtime much shorter than its rival, Twilight Imperium, there are 3 things I like about this one. The first is building really kick-ass ships. Each time you play, you'll be kitting your ships out slightly differently based on the technologies you've researched. Secondly, the control system for your empire is really clever. And finally, it plays in about 1/3 of the time of Twilight Imperium. Space Cadets is an absolutely gonzo and ridiculous game. It's based on the idea of being a bridge crew in Star Trek. But instead of having easy to control systems, all of your stations are wacky minigames. Whether it's reaching into a blind bag to pull out sensor tokens, or flicking a torpedo to see if you hit the enemy, Space Cadets is always a rollicking good time. One quirk of this game, once you get good at the minigames, you can actually operate like a high quality bridge crew as well. It's not just silly. Every time I play a new Legendary game or a Legendary Encounters game, it reminds me how good the Alien deck building game is. Every time I've played Marvel or James Bond, I've sat there going, I wish this was Alien instead. And that's because the systems in Legendary Encounters just seem to work best with the Alien IP. And the 3-act structure in the game works really well with the Alien movie franchise. I'll keep reviewing Legendary games, and hopefully they will beat this one someday. If you're gonna own one auction game, one pure auction game, let it be Modern Art. A stunningly simple game based on the idea that art has no intrinsic value. The only value it has is what we place on it. And that's represented by paintings being worth more the more they're sold. Player demand is what drives up prices in modern art, and I think it's absolutely genius. Simple too. You can play this with practically anyone. They might not quite get how the scoring works and how they're making money, but they'll probably still have fun. This game is about as old as I am, and it's held up stunningly well, probably better than I have. it's still a neat, tense negotiation game where combat is absolutely terrifying, but in order to win the game you have to take monumental risks. And yeah, that can lead to catastrophic failure which can put you out of the game for a while, but you're never completely out due to the alliance system. Definitely a game for veteran groups who really want to invest the time and energy into playing it properly. Because this game's absolutely ruined by someone at the 2-hour mark going, yeah, nah, I'm done with this. Still, there are a few things more satisfying than pulling off a win in June, especially if that win is a Bene Gesserit win. This dinky looking puzzle game is really satisfying to play. Not only the tactile fun from moving the marbles around, but how clever you feel when you set off a chain reaction. It's kid and casual friendly as well. A really neat area control game that probably has too many expansions. But at its core, it's an area control game with multiple paths to victory and emergent powers, two things I really like. This game has an odd combination of worker placement and narrative storytelling choices. And while that seems like it shouldn't really work, it really does in Above and Below's case. It's also one of the most wholesome looking and beautiful board games I own. Lords of Waterdeep is really just a simple worker placement game, where you place workers, collect cubes, and complete missions. And while sometimes it feels like it's got a paper-thin theme, that theme still really works for it, and it remains one of the most accessible and engaging worker placement games I've ever played. A worker placement game where you just keep placing workers on the board. I really like the self-balancing aspects in this game where you're incentivized to go after other people's groups of workers. It creates a natural flow of workers coming onto the board and coming off, without needing a clunky reset phase where everyone takes their bits off the board. Pretty good solo too, and a rare worker placement game that is better at higher player counts. If I feel like playing Scythe these days, chances are I'll end up playing Rurik instead. This game has one of the best action programming systems I've ever seen in any game, as well as a really fun scoring system that rewards risk-taking. What can I say about Isle of Cats? This polynomino game made me fall in love with the genre. I love that it has a family-friendly mode of play, as well as a level for expert players. I also really like that you choose your scoring cards as the game progresses, meaning there really isn't just one way to win this game. You have to adapt to the cards you dealt. And you know what? Stacking cats in a boat is really fun. I like the idea of superheroes, but I'm not a big Marvel or DC fan. What I really do like is Sentinels of the Multiverse. This is a really deep cooperative game with pre-constructed decks for each superhero that make that superhero feel unique and interesting, as well as a ton of different villains that require different approaches to beat. This is the kind of co-op game that if you really get into it, you can play it hundreds and hundreds of times. Also has an exceptionally good quality app, which I have thoroughly played to death. Empires of the Void 2 crams a lot of action into its 2-hour playtime, but probably its strongest suit is the fact that the planets you're fighting over feel interesting, unique, and characterful. In a lot of space games, they're just resource generating rocks. In Empires of the Void 2, each planet feels different. Also an absolutely stunningly good looking game. Power Grid years on is still a gold standard for auctions and network building games. I love how tight every game of this feels, and I really enjoy the natural evolution of the board as more and more regions and power stations come online. This is one of those games I can see being my top 100 for a very long time. Now this is the second edition of the game because I didn't care much for third edition. There are very few games I've played more than Arkham Horror. I've played it several hundred times. Because you know what, back in the mid-2000s, we just had less games, so we played the ones we had a lot more often. I love so much about this game. The sheer variety of characters and great old ones, the ability to tweak and customize your characters, the huge stacks of encounter cards and different places you can go. It really is still the gold standard for heavier cooperative games. This city building game is all about the combos, and you'll be constantly getting new tiles and placing them in your city and maximizing those adjacency bonuses. Definitely not for people who can't handle a little bit of math each turn as you recalculate the values of your city. But for me, I love a little bit of math and find the city building in suburbia incredibly rewarding and engaging. Century Golem Edition is a light, quick, fast-paced deck building game about collecting gems to make golems. It's really just a reskin of Century Spice Road, but I definitely prefer the golem version, it just looks way cuter. This is an exceptional game for families and casual gamers, and one of my go-to games when I've only got about 30 minutes to play. Out there in board game land, there seems to be plenty of people who have an aversion to dice rolls. I am not one of those people, and that's why I really like Pandemic the Cure. It's the dice-based version of Pandemic, and in many ways a far harder and far more interesting game. Each of the characters has its own unique set of custom dice that translate into unique abilities in the game. But fundamentally, it is a very simple push your luck game, because you can re-roll the dice any amount of times you want, but one side of every dice is a dramatic fail. So how many times do you risk it? Incredibly unforgiving, but a hell of a lot of fun. I'm not a huge fan of deck building for the sake of deck building, which is why I really like Tyrants of the Underdark. You see, it has all the aspects you expect from a deck building game, but you get to do something with that deck, and that is fight battles in the Underdark. And as an area control game, it works really well. It's very clever. But fundamentally to me, it works because you get to do something with the deck you have built. It's not just get more gold, score points. The game is a bit fugly, but here the great gameplay trumps all that. Speaking of hating dice rolls and unfair games, here's Dawn of the Zeds. This is a very high complexity tower defense game. We are defending a township from oncoming zombie hordes. It has a huge amount of narrative elements and a lot of risk management. And learning where to hold and when to fall back is fundamental to winning this game, because you never have enough actions. I've lost this game more times than I care to remember, but every win I absolutely remember. Because when you finally do beat Dawn of the Zeds, it's incredibly rewarding. There is a lot to love in Gloomhaven. The card management system is exceptional and absolutely drives this game. Plus the many different characters all feel very different to play. It's fallen a little bit in my estimation simply because I've been playing it so much. And as weird as that sounds that I'm playing a game so I like it less, that's because some of the scenarios are just really unfair if you have the wrong combination of characters. And the constant cycle of retirement and adding new characters to the party, while that can keep things fresh for a while, some of the combos just don't work remotely as well as others. And your finely tuned team can fall to bits as soon as someone retires. That said, I'm probably pushing 100 plays of Gloomhaven, and I'm still enjoying it for the most part. And that card management system is top notch. The Captain is Dead is a great little cooperative game. It's set in the panicked final minutes of a Star Trek style show, where the bridge has exploded, aliens are turning up, and everything's falling to crap. It's what I like to call a firefighting co-op, where every turn new things turn up and new problems emerge, and you have to run around and put out fires. And The Captain is Dead does it as well as any firefighting co-op. I definitely prefer this to any form of Pandemic, but it's also just a fun and cute little game. A real love letter to Star Trek and to those panicky final moments of a dramatic episode. Rules are pretty simple too. Black Orchestra is all about making one single decisive roll at just the right time, and it models a conspiracy really well. You see, not only do your conspirators have to stay secret while they're planning their attack, they also have to build up the nerve to do it. And I find the maneuvering required to get the right kit, to get Hitler in the right place, and get someone willing and able to actually do the assassination attempt really interesting game. Some folks don't like that it comes down to one roll, but I think that's a strength of this game. And I really recommend rolling the dice one at a time for maximum dramatic effect. And when you win, you can say you killed Hitler. I replayed Defenders of the Last Stand recently, and it's such a mess, yet I still love it. It's a tower defense cooperative game, a little bit similar to Dawn of the Zeds, while incorporating elements of Pandemic and Arkham Horror into it. The game tries to do too much, and it should be an absolute shit show, but for some reason the game clicks with me, and I absolutely love it to bits. This is a great example of a game I actually don't recommend people go out and try to hunt down, because there's a really good chance you'll play it and go, wow, this is a hot mess. Yet somehow, it's a perfect hot mess for me. Sadly, this one was made by the same guy who made Agents of Smersh, and they went out of business, so it's unlikely to see a reprint anytime soon. But you might be able to get its cousin, Defenders of the Realm. I've already said I'm a massive fan of Star Trek, so it's probably no surprise that I've ended up really liking Star Trek Ascendancy. Star Trek Ascendancy was new to me this year, but I really dig it. A lot of 4X games have a really crappy exploration element to them. In Star Trek Ascendancy, it's excellent. Building the map and exploring the galaxy is probably the most fun part of it. That said, it does all the 4X stuff, and it does it really quite simply. Most of the rules are very straightforward, and there aren't that many wacky exceptions to the rules. Each of the factions also feels very true to the source material. Like when you're playing as the Federation, you can't conquer planets. You have to bring them on side using diplomatic might. This is definitely a keeper and a game I want to play a hell of a lot more of. Healthy Heart Hospital is one of my most played solo games. The deal behind it is it's a bag manipulator. Each turn you take actions drawing cubes out of a bag, and you can put some of those cubes back in, changing the mix of pieces inside the bag. And it's this little bag manipulation exercise that really engages me for some reason. It also works as a co-op, but I really recommend it primarily for solo play. Now this one's been out of print for a while, but rumor has it, it will be coming back next year, and I'm really looking forward to that. Horrified is now my go-to lightweight co-op, especially when I'm playing with new players or casual gamers. It has quick, easy to learn rules, lots of character, like this is a really fun little thematic game. And it actually remains challenging even if you're an experienced player because you can up the number of monsters. And when you're playing with 4 monsters, the game is quite tough. I really dig that each of the monsters has their own mini-game and their own way of moving, and overall this is just a really solid co-op. Well, with Dawn of the Zeds and other games on here, you think I'm a glutton for punishment, especially when I start talking about Robinson Crusoe. This is another one of those games that is risk management heavy, narrative heavy, and just brutally unforgiving and tough. You will land on the cursed island, you'll get eaten by tigers on the cursed island, you'll freeze to death and drown on the cursed island. It's a brutal, unforgiving, mean game. Yet somehow I keep coming back to it. Now either I'm a game masochist or I love a challenge, one of the two. Either way, if you're a game masochist or love a challenge, try Robinson Crusoe. It's not the simplest game by any means, it is definitely high complexity, and you will spend a while with a rulebook trying to figure the whole thing out. But once you do, and the light comes on, it can be a very rewarding experience. And much like Dawn of the Zeds, when you win a game, you really feel like you've earned it. A 90-minute Civilization game, it can't be done, he said. And then he played Civilization and New Dawn, and well, yeah, it can be done. It can be done pretty damn well. The cornerstone of this game is its action selection system, which many of you might find familiar if you've played Ark Nova. A New Dawn does the smart thing, which is not try to replicate everything that happens in the Civilization PC game. Instead, it abstracts it all, but it does it in a way that feels intuitive. You'll research technologies, make trade agreements, expand, build towns, and do all the stuff you expect in a Civ game, but without tons of micromanagement. Now, the expansion is a bit of a must here. It does add an extra layer to the game, and does push it up to the 2-hour playtime, but I think in every way is an improvement on the original. Some have said that Spartacus is less than the sum of its parts, and I completely and utterly disagree with that assessment. I think the individual phases in the game are okay, but it's the combination of playing them together that makes the game really special. The round starts with backstabbing and betrayals, schemes upon schemes where you're constantly trying to wheedle out a weakness in an opponent to exploit. Then you buy stuff and then you go into the arena and fight. And it's the narrative you build around the arena fights that make them. Because sometimes you can have Spartacus the Great versus a lowly pleb. And of course Spartacus is going to win, but the game is less about who wins the battles and more about who's bet on who's going to win the battles, who has favors riding on this, and about who has schemed their way into having Spartacus fight, Captain Mook in the arena. Definitely a game for people who like a good bit of argy-bargy, and not for people who sulk when they lose stuff. One of my core gaming group's favorite games. Kolejka is a Polish game about queuing in Cold War Poland. And that sounds like an absolutely miserable experience. And it is, but it's also darkly humorous and incredibly mean. You see, there's never enough supplies, and each of you needs to kit out your families by queuing in front of the various shops. So you play different cards to manipulate the queues. And there's so much backstabbing and pettiness in this game. I've also had the great joy of playing this game alongside someone who grew up in this era in Poland. And they thought the game was absolutely hilarious. Not sure if this one's easy to get these days though. Remember how I said I like deck building games where you get to do something with your cards? Well, Blood Bowl Team Manager is that kind of game. Your deck of cards represents your team, but they don't just sit there idly, you play them in a football game. And those football games are really back and forth and quite fun. This is a game I would really like to see reskinned or redone because it can't come back in its current format due to the whole Fantasy Flight Games, Games Workshop deal breaking down. But still, a super fun, super thematic deck building game where you get to play fantasy football. Lots of fun. Museum is a fantastic looking set collection game. And it's all about collecting artifacts from all over the world into a fantastic museum collection. It also doesn't shy away from the fact that some people don't like having their artifacts stolen and put on display somewhere else. And while it is a stunningly good looking game, it's also devilishly clever in places. I particularly like how you can dig through other people's discard piles and take cards off them. This one does not need the expansions. My number one game that really needs a retheme is Chinatown. You're all different families, and you get different allocations of property and shops and have to maximize their efficacy. And you do that by making mutually beneficial trades with everyone else. There's a lot of good vibes around a table when Chinatown's being played. Lots of negotiations, lots of haggling, and it's an incredibly energetic and engaging game. I just kinda wish it wasn't about Chinatown. Gaia Project is one of those games that just makes me feel clever when I play it. You see, there's all these different tech paths you can advance up, and lots of different ways to go about terraforming and placing out your network. And it's a game that when it clicks, you can do incredibly strong and amazing moves. And that can't help but make you feel very, very clever. I do also like Terra Mystica, but vastly prefer Gaia Project. Mostly because I find the tech trees more interesting than the cult system. Santorini is, simply put, one of the most elegant board game designs ever made. Now, it comes with a whole bunch of variable powers you can use to alter the game, but you don't really need to. The core game itself is rock solid, and you can easily play hundreds of games of that. 2-player Santorini with no mods is my favorite. And when it's played like that, it's like a really fast speed chess game. This is also a game you can absolutely teach to kids. Rush MD is 100% the most chaotic, silly, and ridiculous game I own. And I absolutely love it for being that ridiculous and silly. It's a real-time medical management game, where you use sand timers as your workers and have to keep an eye on a whole bunch of stuff happening. It's packed full of mini-games and doing things like having to do surgery with tweezers. With the right group, Rush MD is an absolutely hilarious, tense, and frenetic experience. Not for the faint-hearted though. It's a Wonderful World is one of the tightest engine building games I've ever played. It crams a ton of decisions into its very short playtime, and it only goes for 4 rounds. And in that time you will make decisions that will put good players miles ahead of those who make mistakes. If you like the idea of a fast-paced engine builder, absolutely look at It's a Wonderful World. Speaking of engine builders, here's Le Havre. I love how the fundamental decision points in this game are so straightforward. Yet those decisions have a huge impact on your final score. Very much an engine builder's engine building game, as you'll start off struggling to feed your family and wondering how on earth you're going to actually score any points in the game, before ending the game with way too many goods that you just can't sell. A really great experience with one of the tightest decision spaces in gaming. The crew is dead! Long live the crew too! This cooperative trick-taking game is absolutely wonderful, and it's one of those things that I'm stunned cooperative trick-taking didn't exist before the crew. The crew 2 just takes the crew's format and improves on it in every single way. And there really is no reason to own the original crew now. The crew 2 just does everything better. This is my go-to game to play at the end of a session if we've still got a little bit of time, and people want to play a couple of hands of the crew before heading home. Sidereal Confluence is one of the most ambitious game designs out there. 9 asymmetric factions that are really, really asymmetric. And this game is all about the trading. You see, no player has a rock-solid economy. Everyone has to borrow, beg, and trade from everyone else. And it's all about the wheeling and dealing and negotiations that happen to build up your economy. A truly fascinating game and a really unique experience that gets better with more and more players. Once I have some more time back in my life, I really want to host a bunch of 9-player games. Good writing can make and break a narrative-driven game, and Unsettled has some of the best writing of any game I've come across. The core gameplay of Unsettled is fine. It's a perfectly good cooperative adventure game. What makes it hum is the ridiculous content. You see, in most games like this, you'd be a serious space exploration crew, but in Unsettled, you're a bunch of space muppets. The kind of people who land on an alien world, walk up to the big stack of slick-looking eggs, and jam their head in and go, "Ooh, I wonder what this does!" And that makes the whole experience of playing Unsettled just really charming and engaging. I like that the game is both a cooperative challenge and a rollicking good time. Crisis is a very interesting and unique experience. It's a semi-cooperative worker placement game about trying to make money while an economy is collapsing. And the rub in this game is when you're in the lead, you have an incentive to prop the economy up. But when you're behind, you just don't care. And selling to the black market is incredibly lucrative. Very unforgiving game as well. If you make a mistake, you'll be punished very heavily for it. It's also just a really fascinating game with a ton of great decision points. A must for anyone who likes worker placement and financial games. Circadian's First Light has a new edition, and it's a lot prettier than the old one. Now, the core gameplay hasn't changed, that's still excellent. It's a great dice placement game, and one where you have a ton of things you can do with those dice. What really elevates it for me though is it has an exceptional solo mode. That, and I dig that the faction leader's powers are incredibly over the top and strong. Every time you pick a new one, you're like, ooh, how can I maximize this leader's ability? A really clever game, and easily the most underrated thing that Garfield Games has put out. Junk art is an absolute joy to play. There's something weirdly captivating about stacking these irregular shapes on top of each other. It's like a reverse Jenga. Of all the blocks in Jenga were wacky shapes and really hard to stack to start with. Dexterity games really aren't my thing, but junk art somehow has captured my heart. And I think that's because it's so damn satisfying when you get it right. Because when you look at the bits, you think these shouldn't stack. And yet through the course of the game, you'll end up stacking them 30 odd high. A super family friendly game, but play it on a sturdy table. Seven Wonders is a game that's been out for ages, and yet it's still the very best at what it does. Fast-paced card drafting and set collection. I really dig how the different wonders change how you approach your game, and how you end up in little feuds with the players to your left and right, as well as the many options for scoring. There's one simple reason this game has sold a bazillion copies, and that's because it's really good. Oh, and I also love how well it scales with extra players. A 7-player game isn't that much slower than a 3-player one. Everdell is another game like Root, that looks cute and cuddly and family friendly, but really isn't. Beneath the facade of cute critters is a very tough and very tight worker placement and engine building game. And a game that has a really interesting pattern of play. The first couple of times you play, you'll finish off your tableau way too early, and you'll miss out on a lot of points. And I like that you have to make hard choices here. You can't just grab the first things, throw them into your tableau and go, I got the most stuff, I win. I only played this one with the Pearlbrook expansion, and I don't think the game needs anything more than that, so I skipped getting the big box myself. Sometimes, less is more. App integration in board games is a polarizing thing. Some people hate it, but I personally really dig it. I like that it creates experiences that you can't replicate with just cards. And Mansions of Madness actually allows you to explore a haunted house, without having a player controlling the baddies. I enjoyed the first edition, but it had a hell of a lot of setup, and the person playing the monsters really had to put some work in. The second edition sweeps all of that away and relies on the app. And for me, that was an excellent decision. And if you think there's not enough content for this game, there's plenty of fan-made content out there now as well. But for me, what makes this game works is it is a quintessential haunted house exploration game. Roll for the Galaxy is just a really neat, fast-paced, dice pool and engine building game. The core gameplay is straightforward. Roll dice and assign them, and then pick a phase you want to happen. Only the phases players pick take place. And this leads to some really interesting small tactical decisions. Best played with the Ambition expansion that really completes the game. Super fun, fast, and frenetic. The other Manhattan Project games are pretty good, but Manhattan Project Energy Empire is a cut above the others. And the reason for that is you have this really tight worker placement, combined with some engine building and a really unusual pacing format, where you're placing workers and then generating power. And you control when you generate power. So your normal instinct is to place all your workers out and then reclaim them and generate power. But the key to winning Energy Empire is knowing when to generate power early, and in some cases generate power often to drive the game along. A really clever game, and I'm really looking forward to getting my hands on the expansion. Well, looks like we're getting into the engine building section here, because Paladins of the West Kingdom is next. Another game absolutely crammed with decision making. From what knight to select and meeples to draft all the way through your turn. This game really rewards chaining effects as well. So it's another one of those games that makes you feel super clever when you chain together a long string of moves. Still my absolute favourite game put out by Garfield Games. What to say about Millennium Blades? The card tournament game about being a person in a card tournament. This is a super meta game. It's broken into two parts, a real-time trading phase where you're throwing around fat stacks of cash and picking up cards and trying to desperately build a competitive deck. And the tournament phase, where you get to see if your hurriedly thrown together deck actually works in a tournament situation. Super clever and absolutely unique. There's nothing out there remotely like Millennium Blades. It's definitely a game I recommend you play at least once for the sheer novelty value of it. Azul is as brilliant as it is simple. A tile drafting game about building tiles. Something that sounds frightfully dull until you actually sit down and play it. And then you feel the puzzle of the game evolve in front of you. And you'll be absolutely enraptured by it. Drafting those tiles, trying to maximize your points, this is a super clever game and it really doesn't overstay its welcome. I'm looking forward to giving the chocolate version a go in the near future as well. Xia Legends of a Drift System is the ultimate sandbox game. It's an absolute crapshoot of a game where you can be pottering around in space minding your own business and basically just blow up randomly. So you have to lean into the fact that it's chaotic. You have to try different things. But you can, there's so many things you can do in Xia. You can hunt other players for sport. You can become a trader. You can do archaeology or you can do space mining. You can be a good guy or a bad guy. And you can also just change what you're doing halfway through the game. Xia is the board game equivalent of an old PC game like Elite, where you just get your little freighter, you go off and you do random stuff. Another really unique and really fantastic game. Twilight Struggle used to be my absolute favourite game, and I've absolutely played this to death, which might be why it's dropped down my rankings a little. It's still a super tight game with one of the best card systems in anything in board gaming. The key here is there's one deck of cards, and they have US events and Soviet events. And if you play your opponent's event, their event goes off for free, and you're going to have to play many of your opponent's events. And that's the core drama in this game, is how do you make the best of a bad hand? A handful of cards that are absolutely designed to screw you. What's knocked a bit of polish off it lately for me is it's a long playtime for the game. And the DEFCON system can end in some funny anticlimactic finishes. Arkham Horror the card game is about as close as you're going to get to a tabletop RPG just playing a board game. This one swings up and down in my rankings based entirely on whether I've got to play it recently or not. Because it's a serious time commitment to play through a full campaign, it'll slip out of my mind for a year or two, and then it'll come rocketing back as soon as I play through a campaign, and I'll be going, man, why don't we play this more often? There's a lot of depth here as well. You can play this quite casually with low difficulty, or you can go real hardcore on maximizing your character's decks and play on the higher difficulties. Which is great, because it suits a casual group who just wants to poddle through the adventure and see what the story is, as well as competitive card gamers who really want to tune those decks to the absolute limit. There's a case to be said that I'm overly attracted to novelty, and that's one reason why I like ARGENT the Consortium. It's not just any worker placement game, it's a worker placement game with a massive difference. Instead of fighting over wooden sheep, you're fighting over votes in a magical college, and you have all the tools you'd expect to have at an archmage's disposal. Apprentices, magical relics, and spells. Spells which can blow up entire rooms. In most worker placement games, if someone takes your spot, that's too bad. In ARGENT, you can always just fireball them. And it's the fact that it's a worker placement game that isn't passive aggressive, it's just flat out aggressive, that really, really appeals to me. Leaving Earth is, simply put, an absolute masterpiece of a game. I really like the idea of the space race, and Leaving Earth does it better than any other game. And yeah, it does require a lot of math, and it is a complex game. And you're going to spend a lot of the game sitting there calculating how you're going to slingshot things around planets to meet certain windows in order to get a probe all the way out to Saturn. But if you do want a heavy game, and you do like the idea of space exploration, Leaving Earth does it better than anything else. And this is one of those games where I played it for 4 or 5 hours and just not noticed how much time has gone by. Because everyone involved is just so deep in thought and so engaged with the game. Underwater Cities is one of the tightest games I've ever played. You only have 10 turns and 3 actions per turn. And you have to make those 30 actions absolutely count and maximize them to the best of your ability. It's frequently compared to Terraforming Mars, but in Terraforming Mars, you kind of want to spread out and have lots of actions. In Underwater City, you have to focus. You never get extra actions. It's maximizing every single one that counts. A thoroughly enjoyable and cerebral game that I really recommend for people interested in heavier games. The Castles of Burgundy is a game I really didn't expect to like remotely as much as I do. At its core, each turn you roll 2 dice, and you take 2 actions based on those dice rolls. Thoroughly simple, but somehow the really simple idea of rolling 2 dice and just doing those actions opens up a huge amount of possibilities. This is a really, really neat game, and one of those games where I marvel at just how simple its basic mechanics are, but how deep and rich they are as well. I also found this one a lot more accessible to casual gamers than I was initially expecting. The version I have looks pretty dry and dull, but once people start playing, it hooks them in really, really quickly. It's definitely one of those older games that's worthy of the praise it gets. As far as worker placement games go, you don't get much better than Anachrony. Its core mechanics are absolutely rock solid, but it's the quirks in the game that really elevate it for me. The ability to send resources from your future self to your current self is just a really fascinating idea. Plus, I absolutely dig how it looks on the table. It also comes with a couple of solo modes that are really excellent. Plus, those power suits, they're just neato. Anachrony is a great game for anyone who wants a heavy worker placement game that has a hell of a lot going on. Block by Block looks like your traditional firefighting cooperative game, but it really plays out very, very differently. It's like a small-scale war game, and it really captures the feel of rolling street battles and slowly building up influence in order to take over a city. And it's really big on collective action. To do well in this game, you have to work as a team. Plus, I just can't help but admire its incredibly confrontational theme. This is a political game that has a political message and isn't afraid to cram that down your throat. Another game with a really easy to learn and accessible rule system as well. Yokohama is a game that my estimation of it just goes up every time I play it. It's set in one of those fascinating periods of history, the Meiji Restoration, where Japan went from a feudal country to an industrial country in 2 generations. And you're one of the industrialists leading this revolution. Yokohama has a huge amount of decisions to make, and while it feels like a sort of worker placement game, It's almost a sandbox where you can roam around the board and do just a whole bunch of different things. It can definitely be overwhelming on your first couple of plays figuring out what all the locations do and how to maximize your movement around the board. I also love that it's a Japanese game about Japanese history made by a Japanese designer. That just adds a degree of authenticity to the setting. Definitely recommend this one for any heavy Eurogame fans who want to try something a little bit different, and who aren't afraid of being overwhelmed by the sheer volume of decisions you can make. The same group I play Spartacus with also loves Battlestar Galactica. It's still one of our go-to games for a night of finger-pointing, accusations, and recriminations. And while this one's long out of print and goes for a hell of a lot on the second-hand market, it did get reskinned recently as Unfathomable, which offers almost the same game experience. This game is super group dependent, but if you have the right group who just gets it, and really gets into what's happening at the table, there are a few game experiences as crazy, fun, and outrageously over the top as a good game of Battlestar Galactica. It's also one of the few games I made a fan expansion for, and you can find that on Board Game Geek. And just before we head into the top 10, here's the list of games that dropped off the list this year. Some of these, like The Crew and Hostage Negotiator, dropped off because similar games came along and took their place. And in those two cases, that's The Crew 2 and Final Girl. Some games also just dropped off because they were towards the edge of the list. And finally, Twilight Imperium dropped off because after playing Ascendancy, Eclipse, Civilization and New Dawn, I have played so many new 4X games lately that I just enjoy more. Anyway, those are the games that left the top 100 this year. Now back to it. Paths of Glory is a card-driven war game about the First World War, and it's absolutely brilliant. The First World War is a really grim exercise, and Paths of Glory captures that. Attacking in this game it's a painful experience. But the necessities of the game mean you have to attack. And I think this is really exemplified by how the Western versus Eastern fronts work. The Germans can dig in on the Western front, and you have to attack them with your French and British forces and take horrific casualties. But if you don't do that, the Germans can use all their forces on the Russian front and just go hog wild. You have to make attacks that are awful, just to force attrition onto your opponent. The other thing I really like in this game is that there's just so many fronts and operations, and you only have 6 actions per turn. So the war can flare up in different places. All of a sudden the Balkans can get hot and there can be a lot of fighting there. Or you can battle across the Isonzo River for the 12th time. This is a high complexity game and really one for wargamers. But if you do want to try out one serious wargame in your life, you could do a lot worse than playing Paths of Glory. This War of Mine is less of a board game and more of an experience. It's a cooperative game about surviving in a siege, and it deals with that grim setting incredibly powerfully and very truthfully. There's an emotional cost to playing this War of Mine, but it is a really memorable experience. And mechanically there's a lot to do as well. There's story elements, there's building up your house, and there's a lot of resource management required to, eke out an existence in a bombed out building. Another one of those games that I recommend you try at least once, just for the experience. It might not be your cup of tea, but I think you'll be a richer person for giving it a go. War of the Ring is an excellent grand strategy game, and it's one that's driven by characters and events. Here you are playing out the events of Lord of the Rings, but you're in control of them, and each faction has 2 ways to win. You can either sink the ring or corrupt the ring bearer, or win a military victory. And of course, the Shadow player has a lot more military forces than the Free People, and unlimited reserves. And it's this combination of asymmetry, different paths to victory, and character-driven events that make War of the Ring feel really cool each time you play it. And some weird and wacky stuff happens. One of my favourite games of all time ended with the Haradrim bypassing Rohan completely, driving straight into the Shire and then burning the Grey Havens. And other games have had dramatic final battles at Minas Tirith, or at the Lonely Mountain, or right in front of the Gates of Mordor. It's War of the Ring, but it's not scripted to play out exactly as the films and the books do. And that's what I really like about it. You make your own version of Lord of the Rings. Obsession gets a lot of praise for its really neat theme. This management of an old English country house, with your servants and entertaining people and all that kind of carry on. And while that praise is rightfully deserved, Obsession is also a super tight game design in and of itself. You have very limited actions and you have to absolutely maximize them throughout the entire course of the game. And it's a great example of how a theme can elevate some really good core mechanics, but also inform those mechanics. Everything you do in the game works to elevate your family's reputation and standing. And I just think it's a perfect synthesis of theme and great gameplay. Brass Birmingham was not a game I was expecting to like, and not expecting to like it remotely as much as I have. From the outside, it looked like yet another boring train game, but that's not what Brass Birmingham is at all. It's a game about opportunism. You have a limited number of actions you can take using the cards, but what really informs those actions are what the other players are doing. And it's picking the right moment to put down a coal mine, or an iron mine, or a brewery, so you can get the maximum advantage out of them. And one thing I love in this game is that other players can use your resources, and you want them to use them, because when they use them, that gives you a huge boost. So there's a lot of mutually beneficial interactions in Brass. I really like Nemesis, and I like it for a bunch of reasons. The first of which is the obvious one. It's a really neat alien-themed game with a bunch of backstabs and betrayals, and I'm a big fan of backstabbing and betrayal in games. The second one is, though, that it comes with a rock-solid co-op mode, and a lot of people tend to overlook this. If you're not interested in backstabbing and betrayals, you can play the co-op mode, and it works fine. Then it's just a tense cooperative horror survival game. And finally, it works really well solo, playing the cooperative mode with multiple characters. Nemesis is just a super thematic game, and one that captures the feeling of being stuck on a scary spaceship really well. Not to mention it looks absolutely great on the table. I still haven't got around to playing Lockdown, but I can't imagine I'm going to put them as separate entries on this list. So when I get around to playing Lockdown, it may hurt or hinder the rating here. Who knows? But it is basically the one game I got around to trying to paint this year. And that's a really good sign, because I don't tend to paint games I don't like. Definitely pick this one up if you like the idea of survival horror, but keep in mind that the betrayal is opt-in, and you can play this game straight up and clean. Thunderbirds is, simply put, one of the best co-op games I've ever played. You can see the design DNA here, because it's created by the same guy who made Pandemic. But Thunderbirds requires a whole extra level of thinking, because to resolve all the issues you need to get the right kit and equipment in place. So there is this logistical element to the game that really appeals to me. You gotta get the right personnel, the right gear, and the right Thunderbirds in the right place to get the best results possible. And that requires planning over multiple turns. So many firefighting co-ops are a couple of cubes pop up in a spot and you have to deal with them before they explode. Thunderbirds is more than that, and that's one of the reasons I really dig it. It's pretty hard to get these days because it was a limited print run, but if you can track down a copy, and you do like co-op games, give it a shot. Everything I said about War of the Ring really applies to Star Wars Rebellion as well. The main difference, of course, being you're playing out Star Wars instead of the Lord of the Rings. This is another character-driven grand strategy game, and it's even more character-driven than War of the Ring, which is probably why I prefer it. Every action in the game is conducted by one of your characters, and who you send on what missions has a huge impact. And it's full of really neat character moments, like people getting frozen in carbonite, or the Emperor trying to turn Luke to the dark side. Heck, the Emperor can even turn Obi-Wan to the dark side. And it's the fact that Star Wars plays out differently each time that, again, really appeals to me. There's also a great tension in this game, as the Imperial player has so many resources, and their main goal is just to find that hidden Rebel base and destroy it. And the Rebel player is trying to score enough victory points before that happens. So you have this amazing tension, and the game comes down to the wire so often. I've lost track of the number of games that have either been won on the last possible turn by the Imperial player blowing up the Rebel base, or where the Rebels hit the victory point total just as the Imperial fleet is closing in. A pretty much perfect example of how you take a theme and make a grand strategy game around it that feels true to the source material and is also a hell of a lot of fun. Now we're down to the final two, and I've tested a lot of games this year and played a lot of games, and the number of times I've been playing a pretty average game and looked up at the shelf and gone, I wish I was playing Terraforming Mars, I've lost track of. Terraforming Mars is a comfort game for me. I love the engine building in it so much. Every time I set up the board and pick a new corporation to play, I'm excited about it because I know I'm going to have a really good time for the next 3 hours or so. There's so many different things to do, so many cool engines you can build, and it's just a great game for someone like me who really likes engine building. We tend not to play without turmoil because I think that just adds an extra layer of complexity the game doesn't really need. And I guess the elephant in the room here is Ark Nova, and well, playing Ark Nova just made me like Terraforming Mars more. And I know Ark Nova is an incredibly popular game out there, and I enjoyed it enough, but every time I was playing it I was like, I kinda wish I was playing Terraforming Mars instead. So Terraforming Mars stays as my number 2 game. And in the least surprising turn of events, Spirit Island is still my number one after many years at the top. But it's going to be a couple of interesting years for Spirit Island as they're adding in a whole bunch of new spirits. So there's 5 in the Horizons of Spirit Island box that just got released, as well as 8 new ones coming out in another expansion. And for a game like this, it's going to be interesting to see how all that extra content integrates. Will the game finally get overloaded to the point where I don't enjoy it anymore? Let's find out. But anyway, Spirit Island is a great cooperative game. It's got a huge amount of depth, the spirits have stunning levels of asymmetry, and it just has an excellent rising tension throughout the course of the game as you start off very weak and build up to be very powerful. And it's whether you can get to the top of that power curve before the bad guys do and cause a dramatic tipping point to win the game that makes it such a compelling and interesting experience each and every time I play. And at some point this year, I really hope to work on my own fan-made spirit. I've got some ideas. And you know if I'm making my own expansions for a game that I really dig it. And also, the final thing with Spirit Island is the theme, the whole idea of it. Being from Aotearoa, New Zealand, a colonised island, a whole bunch of what happens in the game really resonates with me. And the whole feel of the spirits really reminds me of the stories of Taniwhara I grew up with. So yeah, a perfect combination of a theme that really engages me, amazing gameplay, and stunning amounts of depth and asymmetry. Keep Spirit Island my number one game for 2022. Well, that's the list, and I hope you enjoyed it. This video was prepared while I was recovering from COVID, so apologies if the audio is a bit up and down in places. And if you want to support independently made content, made from the heart, not for the publishers, please come support us on Patreon. Check out our web store, and like, share, and subscribe to the channel.